Good morning, all. It is great to have you here in class today. We appreciate every one of you. We are probably will begin reading today in Job 23. If you want to open your Bibles to Job 23, we will have the lesson. We're on, I guess it's week 6, and I don't guess there are page numbers on that. In the book, it's probably on page 45, but I'll probably review again the big picture before we go to that on page 43, the place of the passage. In a way that seems designed to frustrate and tire the reader, the debate continues between Job and his friends over the reason for his suffering and the moral coherence of God's world, with none of the participants substantially changing their position. So basically they're all saying about the same thing. Job, you're a sinner. That's the reason these bad things have happened to you. And Job is saying back to them, well, if I'm a sinner, show me where I've sinned. In fact, I wish I could talk to God, because God appears to be ruling the universe in a very unjust way. If God truly rewards the righteous and punishes the sinner, then He's got things mixed up with me. So I would just love to talk to God, just to let Him know. Let my feelings be heard. The friends continue to cling to their rigid understanding of retributive justice. That is, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Job, on the other hand, will continue to question God's justice and will express a remarkable faith that somehow he and God will be reconciled. The only new element in the debate's final round is that Bildad has just a very short response in chapter 25. And Zophar says nothing at all. I guess they basically have run out of things to say. It is as if the friends run out of things to say as the book's journeys closer to Job's encounter with God. All right, last week we looked at Eliphaz's speech. And today, in chapter 23, this is Job responding to Eliphaz. Even today, my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. In other words, God continues to cause bad things to happen to him in spite of the fact that he's already suffering. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say. Would he oppose me with great power? No, he would not press charges against me. There an upright man could present his case before him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. So he really has a positive mindset, and that seems to have shifted a bit. A positive mindset, how God might receive him had he basically been able to have that face to face. But if I go to the east, he is not there. This is what he's saying. He's looking for God. But I go to the east, but he's not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I cannot catch a glimpse of him. But he knows the way that I take when he has tested me. I will come forth as gold. You notice the positive frame of mind that he seems to be displaying. My feet have closely followed his steps. I've kept to his way without turning aside. I've not departed from the commands of his lips. I've treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. But he stands alone, and who can oppose him? In other words, he's God, right? Why should I expect that he's going to pay attention to me? I'm going to take this we still keep getting a little static. I'm going to try to put it on my belt instead of in my pocket. But I can't believe you. That works so much better. Not being in my pocket, but being on the belt. So, but he stands alone. Who can oppose him? He does whatever he pleases. He carries out his decree against me, and many such plans he still has in store. He is a bit pessimistic about what's to come for him. He says, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. I believe if I had a face-to-face with him, he would vindicate me. But right now, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. That is why I'm terrified before him. When I think of all this, I fear him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me, yet I am not silenced by the darkness, by the thick darkness that covers my face. Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? Whenever we say judgment, what's the first thing you think of? You think of courtroom, judgment. All right, it's either right or wrong. You're either all right. You're either going free or going to jail. You're good or you're bad. You'll be found guilty or you'll be found not guilty. A lot of times when we think of judgment, we think of the final judgment, when people are going to be thrown in hell, right? And we sometimes think of judgment as a negative thing. Don't you judge me. But with God, judgment is something that is both positive and negative. The guilty have a right to fear judgment. But a Christian, a Christ follower, those who are right with God, has no reason to fear judgment, because that judgment will lead to our vindication. That judgment will lead to our eternal life with him in eternity. So judgment is a positive thing, and that's why he's looking forward to this judgment. He says, I just know that if I appear before God, I'm going to get a positive answer to what's happened to me. Let's see. Remember how in the previous Eliphaz's statement, how he made some very specific charges against Job? I mean, you haven't taken care of the poor, you have oppressed the widow and the orphan, you've moved the boundary markers and such as that. He goes beyond the hypothetical. Prior to this, they don't know what Job may have done wrong. But now it seems that they're saying, no, Job, this is something that you have done. Obviously, you have done these things. And we mentioned, if you recall, that while Eliphaz was wrong in regard to Job, these are sins that God hates. God hates when people oppress people. God hates when we do not help the poor. God hates all of these things. And there will be judgment that will come from that. So that is positive. But he seems to be making that applicable to Job, which it is not. He says, why must those who know him look in vain for such days? He said, why should I look in vain to be vindicated by God, or for this judgment that will prove me to be righteous? Men move boundary stones. They pasture flocks they have stolen. They drive away the orphan's donkey and take the widow's ox in pledge. They thrust the needy from the path and force all the poor of the land into hiding. Like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor go about their labor of foraging food. The wasteland provides food for their children. They gather fodder in the fields and glean in the vineyards of the wicked. Lacking clothes, they spend the night naked. They have nothing to cover themselves in the cold. They are drenched by mountain rains and hug the rocks for lack of shelter. The fatherless child is snatched from the breast. The infant of the poor is seized for a debt. Lacking clothes, they go about naked. They carry the sheaves, but still go hungry. They crush olives among the terraces. They tread the winepresses, yet suffer thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help. But God charges no one with wrongdoing. Now, what's he saying there? He lists all the things, all the injustices that occur in the world. And as he summarizes his list, he says at the end, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. What do you think that means? Not really. God hasn't charged me with that. And he says these things seem to happen in the world. They aren't necessarily caused by anyone in particular. God does not charge them. There's something, a phrase that we often hear. It's called the human condition. And it has to do with just the state of the world, how we live, the things that happen, suffering that occurs. And these things happen, and it doesn't necessarily have to be caused by anyone. It just is. It's just the way it is. And so, yes, because we're in a world that is suffering the ravages of sin. And if you want to think about it as a cursed world, I mean, Genesis seems to bring that idea into effect because we think of the curses, death, and everything that death brings with it but it was because of the sinfulness in the garden. The fact that Adam would earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, and the pain in childbirth, and he even mentions the conflict that will happen between husband and wife and men and women in the world. He said all of this is a part of sin. This list is just expanded, but it would probably fall into the category of death as much as anything else. Another way of looking at all of these things, but yet God charges no one with wrongdoing. What he's saying is, even those who perpetrate these acts deliberately, their judgment is not apparent. In other words, someone may oppress the poor, someone may do all of these bad things, and they may do so for years without God saying one thing to them. And so here I am, a righteous man, and you're accusing me of these things, which obviously I have not done. I would imagine that you wouldn't necessarily even need to have an audience with God to prove that fact. Job's neighbors, Job's servants, those with whom he interacted, were there a court in the land that would call them to testify? They would testify to Job's righteousness. No, he always treated me right. In fact, he always went out of his way to do good things for me, to make sure that I was paid enough. If he had a good harvest, he shared that harvest with us. I'm sure anyone that was asked that would be able to do that. But yet he says, but God seems to be slow about charging people with wrongdoing. And this is something, a theology, a way of thinking, a way of looking at things that his friends had yet to understand, to recognize. We see it today. We know that there are bad people in the world, and it seems that they continue to do their bad things, and God has just turned a blind eye to it. We're not seeing them punished. I think with further revelation, we understand that God doesn't settle all debts here on earth. And he doesn't always settle all debts on a one-to-one kind of basis with people. The word is they're storing up judgment. It's kind of what the Bible would say. Just as we store up righteousness by our good things, Jesus says you can send your riches onto heaven by helping people here on earth. So we store up righteousness. So it's possible to store up judgment as well for the last day. But God is going to take care of them. But he says as far as man's timetable and man's perspective, it's just not forthcoming. There are those who rebel against the light, who do not know its ways or stay in its path. When daylight is gone, the murderer rises up and kills the poor and the needy. In the night he steals forth like a thief. The eye of the adulterer watches for dusk. He thinks, no eye will see me, and he keeps his face concealed. In the dark, men break into houses, but by day they shut themselves in. They want nothing to do with the light. For all of them, deep darkness is their morning, and they make friends with the terrors of darkness. Yet they are foam on the surface of the water. Their portion of the land is cursed, so that no one goes to his vineyards. As heat and drought snatch away the melted snow, so the grave snatches away those who have sinned. The womb forgets them, the worm feasts on them. Evil men are no longer remembered, but are broken like a tree. They prey on the barren and childless women, and to the widow show no kindness. But God drags away the mighty by his power. Though they become established, they have no assurance of life. He may let them rest in a feeling of security, but his eyes are on their ways. For a little while they are exalted, and then they are gone. And he mentions that's going to be the ultimate plight of all of these who do wicked. But again, it's in God's own time that it happens. He may let them rest in a feeling of security, but his eyes are on their ways. For a little while they are exalted, and then they are gone. They are brought low and gathered up like all others. They are cut off like heads of grain. If this is not so, who can prove me false and reduce my words to nothing? I'm going to go down to the bottom of page 45 and ask this question. In what ways does Job state that mankind takes advantage of God's apparent slowness to judgment? I'm sorry, go ahead. They are disobedient, creating hardship for others. They are cruel and thoughtless. All right, because of it. What's God going to do about it? Hadn't done anything yet, right? Go ahead. Peter said that very thing in 2 Peter, I think it's chapter 3, where he says, but God is not slack concerning his promises, but is long-suffering to usward. I'm quoting the King James Version, that's where I memorized it. Is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the fact is, he's saying that the long-suffering of the Lord is to encourage salvation in the long run. So God isn't allowing them to get away with anything. But what God is doing is He's giving them a chance to respond. I read an article the other day about shoplifting in some of these major box stores that there are. We had a member in Mississippi who was what was the word? Inventory control or inventory something is the word that they use. In other words, to try to keep people from stealing. And all she does all day is sit back there on those monitors and she watches people. She sees exactly what happens. And she sees when people shoplift and such, and it's being recorded. And they say that you, in that instance, you will always get caught. It may not be today when you're doing it, but just know that they know what you're doing. And they are building a case against you. And so that's basically what Job is saying, is just because justice doesn't come today, it doesn't mean a case isn't being prepared against you. Go ahead. I can get by with it. I got by with it once. It was easy. You know, you could just see them laughing, talking to their friends or someone, bragging about what they did. Man, that was so easy. I was able to get that whole big screen up under my blouse. Nobody said a word. You know, we laugh at that, but there have been some that have been almost that bold as far as taking things away. So we've actually seen, as I mentioned, kind of a shift in the way Job is looking at things. While he is saying that God is treating me unjustly, he seems to be holding on to the fact that God, like with the wicked that aren't being judged now, he as a righteous man is going to be vindicated later. So he's holding up. Job it's almost like he goes right up to the line of cursing God, but he never crosses that line. And he seems to be, the more he talks to his friends, the more of a positive and more faithful view he seems to be taking. Is that do you have, like this would be the middle question on page 45, some of you, if you have, if you worked your workbooks, have you have anything that you said about that? How is it that his faith in God keeps driving him to a more optimistic position, I suppose, is how we might ask it in other ways. Did you have an answer in your workbook that you... Yes, go ahead, Jerry. All right, Job is to be commended the fact that he continues to put his trust in God, that eventually God is going to work all these things out. Peter said something in the first epistle. Let us who suffer, now this is probably a whole mixed up paraphrase translation. Let those who suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to Him as unto a faithful Creator. Now I want you to notice what he says. Let those who suffer according to the will of God. That first statement, what does that say? Let those who suffer according to the will of God. How do we dissect that? Yes. All right, that is an example of someone who suffered and did so with God's approval, or according to the will of God would be another way of saying it. Yes, and that she spoke of Jesus and His suffering. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. And that is what Peter is talking about there. He is talking about persecution. But notice what he says, according to the will of God. How can you reconcile that? Okay. All right. So it's not necessarily a punishment to us. It doesn't necessarily affect our eternal destiny. Anyone else? All right, it's a matter of, that's the second part, trust the keeping of our souls to Him as unto a faithful Creator. I believe he's saying that God is in control of everything. The theologians call that the sovereignty of God. God is sovereign. He's over everything. He controls everything. Well, if that's the case, then why does He allow bad things to happen, like suffering? Well, He allows things to happen, and in so doing, it is according to His will. Now, we'll have to delve a little bit deeper if we get into the theological reasons for that. Tina and I were talking about that question just the other day, why bad things happen. I gave an off-the-cuff response, but I think it was zeroing in on the truth, if it was not a full answer. One way is that because of sin, we are living in a fallen world, and bad things happen. See, the whole world was affected by sinfulness, not just people. And as a result of that, there are things like tornadoes, there are things like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires, pandemics, sicknesses. All of those things are part of the fallen world in which we live. There's another sense, though, in that when God placed us here, He put us in control of the world. He said we are to reign, we are to rule in the world. But when we sinned, we turned to Satan and we said, here you go. Here are the keys to the store. And we basically shifted our allegiance from God to Satan. And we turned the world over to him. That's the reason the Bible says that Satan is now the ruler of the world. Well, that doesn't mean that God is stronger than Satan. God can overrule Satan at any time. But right now, bad things happen because of the evil one. Because we basically abdicated our role of being God here on earth. God put us here to be His image bearers. That's what I mean about being God here on earth. Representing God here on earth may be a better way of putting that. So, let those who suffer according to the will of God, God is sovereign. He may allow it to happen, even though He may not want it to happen in regard to you suffering. God at no point, I believe, wants to see us suffer unless somehow we will be better for it. Not all suffering is better, you know. Go ahead. Mm. That's what brought me, even though she'd been raised in a Christian family and all, that's what He had to do to get her to come to Him. So yes, it's suffering, but then eventually she turned it around and she's like, okay, I'm really not suffering. It's what God did to get me close to Him. Very good. We don't know what is good and best for us, but God does. And in the illustration you gave, Joni Erickson Tata, I believe is her name, who was injured and has been most of her life in a wheelchair, she says, it is because of this that I know God. Very good. Anyone else? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, another way of looking at it too is the quote good that came out of Job's suffering. If we want to look at that, or there being a reason for it, if you recall, Satan had made an accusation against Job that Job is not serving you for nothing; he's serving you for the stuff, for the blessings, for all that you have given him. And in allowing Satan to do these things to Job, what God is doing is vindicating him already. He's vindicating him spiritually. That indeed Job is a righteous man, because look at all the things you've done to him and he still hasn't. So he's made a statement to Satan about the goodness of Job, and he has vindicated him in heaven, so to speak. And before the book is over, he's going to vindicate Job again on earth. But just think about, we have this story of Job today to look at, to read, to take encouragement from in our moments of perplexity and suffering, and say, look, I'm not alone in this. Even James uses that when he talks about waiting until Jesus comes again. He says, remember the sufferings of Job. Yes, Vic. He did. Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a Christian version of that. Let's see. Let's look on page 46 of our lesson book. Let's look at point number 3, Bildad's last speech. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, dominion and all belong to God. He establishes order in the heights of heaven. Can his forces be numbered? Upon whom does his light not rise? How then can a man be righteous before God? Even if the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less man who is but a maggot, a son of man who is only a worm? He says, so how is it possible for a man to be righteous in God's eyes? Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Is that not theologically correct? I mean, that is theologically correct. Human beings cannot be righteous before God. And he's applying that to Job, but we've already been told something about Job. And what have we been told about Job? He's righteous. He's a good man. He is blameless. That's the reason every week I think we need to remind ourselves Job is not just an example of every man, because that cannot be said of us. That cannot be said of us. But this story is about how a truly righteous man, now the word perfect is never used, but how a truly righteous man can still suffer and not just be punished by God. One of the first things we often do is when something bad happens to us, we say, well, what have I done? How have I offended God that this should happen? And you know, that may have absolutely nothing to do about your sin. Sometimes sin will bring its own consequences. That's true. But Job has just told us that sometimes those consequences are slow to come and may only come in the afterlife. So we need to realize that while none of us are righteous, our suffering may not be due to any specific sin. I mentioned before a relative of mine who said, you know, I really need to get back in church. I've been having a lot of bad luck. And I said, well, you do need to get back in church. I said, but your bad luck probably comes more from your poor decisions than anything else. Go ahead. He did. He certainly was. Well, Bildad is so concerned to make Job out to be a sinner that he insists no human being could ever be right with God. Bildad further insists that even the most exalted dimensions of creation are displeasing to God. How does this square with creation texts like Genesis 1 and Psalm 104? What did God say about his creation when it was made? It was good. He said it is very good. In fact, what reasons does Bildad give in verses 5 through 6 for insisting that everything in creation is disgusting to God? Is this a valid defense? Uh-huh. Okay, very good. Okay. Very good. God made it, therefore it is good. And so he seems to be off when he talks about that. All right, Job's last response to Bildad. I don't think we have time to read the last response because it continues for 2 chapters as well. Job's speech, and some of you, though, who read ahead and did all your lesson, in chapter 26 is one of the most stirring in the entire book. His words seem provoked by Bildad's statement in 25:2 about God's dominion in heaven, almost as if Job is going to open Bildad's eyes as to what the dominion really looks like. In the opening 3 verses of the chapter, how does Job fault Bildad? What must wisdom be able to do in order for it to be real? And we'll read the first 3 verses. Job replied, "How you have helped the powerless, how you have saved the arm that is feeble. What advice you have offered to one without wisdom, and what great insight you have displayed. Who has helped you utter these words, and whose spirit spoke from your mouth?" Job's being sarcastic. You get the idea. And he often begins his speeches with those words. He says, but what is he saying in so doing? All right, he's saying they're lousy comforters, and you don't know what you're talking about, is basically what he's saying. You don't know what you're talking about there in regard. Job describes different aspects of God's creation in verses 5 through 10. The Old Testament descriptions of creation often emphasize the security and stability of the environment God made for human beings. What parts of the cosmos are described in these verses, and how are the stability and goodness of God's creation emphasized? That's 5 through 10. What did you put in your lesson book? Yeah, he mentions even death is naked before God, destruction lies uncovered. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. In other words, he's speaking of the order that is to be found in creation, the good things. He wraps up the clouds, wraps up waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. He covers the face of the full moon, spreading his clouds over it. He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. So he speaks of there being order in God's creation. It's not evil or bad. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Well, they certainly didn't have any satellite or spaceship shots, did they? Yeah, many people have held that view throughout history. Yeah, that's true. Let's look on page 48. The gospel glimpses. The dangers of foolish speech. It is impossible to read Job carefully without being sobered by our ability to damage people God loves and approves of merely by what we say. Just like Job's friends, we can sound very spiritually and give advice that is superficially plausible and theologically correct, only to malign deeply a servant of God. Now, I have mentioned this before, and I'm not saying that you're one who does that, but there was a gentleman at the previous congregation. His standard, if you ever ask how he was doing, he says, "Too blessed to be stressed." Too blessed to be stressed. And that was always his standard answer until he got stressed. His actually, God had blessed him in many, many ways, he and his wife. But his wife got to the point where he had to take care of her, almost wait on her hand and foot. And he himself, I think, was in his... What do you think? You think, Tina, he was in his 90s? I think he was in his 80s anyway. But he was at the point in time in his life where he didn't have a lot of energy to take care of his wife. And I noticed he quit saying that. You know, listen, I don't want to say that we don't need to be enthusiastic, that we don't need to be positive and upbeat, because there are too many people you ask how they're doing and they pull out their list. You know, there are none of us that want to hear that list, right? We just want to have them nod, okay, and we go on. But the fact is, we should be very careful how we imply. Like this morning, my lesson is going to be on discouragement, and of course, what often comes after discouragement, if it progresses, depression. We Christians, many in the church, have sometimes left the impression with people that it's unspiritual to be discouraged, or that it's unspiritual to be depressed. Listen, folks, I've got diabetes. It's not unspiritual to have diabetes. You know, I'm sorry, it's just not. And you say, well, you obviously have eaten too much in your life, and that may be the case, and that may be a contributing factor. But there are many people that come into this world that way. You know what I'm saying? So where is the sin there? It's not unspiritual to have a medical issue or a medical problem or to struggle. We're going to see in the case of Elijah today how he actually did that. Go ahead. Yeah, God often used broken people to accomplish His will. So we just need to be very careful the impression that we leave people, that if you're depressed or if you have an issue, that somehow you've done something wrong. And that's exactly what Job's friends are saying. Well, this is about all the time that we have today. Next week we'll be looking at Job 7. If you will, please read Job 28 through 31. Again, if this book is available, and I can give you the link, but this entire workbook is available online, and you can go to it and you can read and answer the lesson questions. I have a couple of these left. If you have not gotten one, I'll be happy to provide it for you. And anyway, if you will, please read your text, and I appreciate your attention.